Well, Tom Rayner is here, and also we're going to be speaking to the Conservative MP for Clwyd West in just a moment, David Jones, who is, of course, a former Brexit minister. But, Tom, first of all, I mean, talk about powers. We were told the UK was going to take back control. Taking back powers from Brussels to Westminster is exactly what people voted for, isn't it?
Yes, but what this dilemma indicates is the fact that the simple overall argument of Brexit and the intentions sometimes clashes with the detail. And the problem here is that the devolution settlements established by Tony Blair were predicated on the existence of the EU setting ultimately a kind of baseline regulatory frameworks within which all of the devolved powers could operate. And so that is a practical problem that the government are trying to solve. Their solution is to call this body of law that the EU operates EU-retained law as part of that EU withdrawal bill to maintain this consistency, this ability for Welsh lamb to be sold in Scotland, and the knowledge that the regulations that that farmer is operating under are the same. But the position of those devolved powers, and this is an unlikely partnership, isn't it, between a Labour First Minister of Wales and an SNP Scottish First Minister, two parties which have toxic relations in every other case, because they say that it is simply not acceptable that for process and pragmatism, which is what the government often referred to in terms of the needs of this EU withdrawal bill, that the underlying basis of the devolution settlements, which was to give control over areas like agriculture, they don't want that to be undermined. And that is why what Carwyn Jones is saying is that these powers should come back to the devolved powers. It should be taken on trust by the government that because there is a commitment from both Wales and Scotland to observe these kind of common frameworks which are being worked towards, that that is the way to do it that will preserve the internal market. But it's an issue for the government, this.
OK, let's put that to David Jones. I mean, this is just yet another example of Brexit means Brexit and no one really thinking through what the implications are.
Well, of course, devolution, if you like, is the other front in the Brexit battle.
Well, that's what Carwyn Jones was saying. They had a referendum and they voted for a devolved government.
Which is quite true. But by the way, Wales actually also voted to leave the European Union. So it is an issue. Carwyn Jones is right to draw attention to it. But if you speak to people who are most nearly affected by this problem, in this particular case, the farmers, you will see, as in fact we heard from Abby Reader there, that what farmers want is an overarching UK-wide framework. That is something that is currently exercised in Brussels. It's clearly got to be exercised at a UK level. The farmers are actually supportive to that extent of the UK government's position. And what the UK government now needs to do is to work out how that framework will operate with the devolved administration.
But some of the powers being taken back would be more appropriately devolved, wouldn't they?
Some of them would, and in fact the government has been quite open about that. They have said that ultimately they foresee a large tranche of powers being passed on to Brussels. Well, it remains to be negotiated, but certainly in terms of agriculture there would be more powers, I have no doubt, that would be exercised at a Welsh or Scottish level. But certainly also there are other powers which are UK framework, are EU framework powers at the moment that should be exercised at a UK level, and I think that really everybody's agreed about that.
Do you think that withdrawing from the European Union strengthens the Union, if you like, the centre of the UK, and therefore almost inevitably is going to weaken the relevance of devolution?
It shouldn't. I think that if it's handled properly, then we can actually see a devolution settlement in the UK that remains strong. But at the same time, I think that the devolved administrations have to recognise that there are some powers that really logically and sensibly belong at a UK level.
I mean, of course, there is a whole question of what the role of Parliament's Cardiff, Holyrood, but also Westminster is in this devolution process. We've just heard there's going to be an urgent question today following the suggestion from David Davis that we could exit the European Union without having had a vote in Parliament. Would that be acceptable to you?
No, and I think actually that what David Davis was doing was trying to illustrate an extreme theoretical position. I think that there is no doubt that there will be a vote in Parliament before the UK leaves the European Union in March 2019. The government has promised a meaningful vote, and of course, to be meaningful, that vote has to take place before we actually
But what's
leave.
interesting is we didn't get that simple statement you've just made from any government minister yesterday.
Well, given that I'm not a government minister
I understand,
anymore,
I understand that. But all I'm saying is,
you
you can understand a certain amount of scepticism about how committed the government really is to this if you go back to the whole Gina Miller case about this meaningful vote.
Well, I think that there has to be a meaningful vote. I actually was the government minister who promised a meaningful vote on the floor of the House of Commons, and that, of course, is something that will have to take place before we leave. I think that David Davis's remark yesterday was, as I say, an extreme position, which is theoretical and won't actually happen.
Can I just ask you what you mean by a meaningful vote?
Well, a meaningful vote is a vote on the deal as negotiated by the British government, and which is then presented to Parliament, and Parliament can then decide whether it approves of that deal.
So if Parliament approves the deal, full steam ahead, we understand where we are. What happens if Parliament doesn't approve that deal?
Well, in that circumstance, then there will be no deal, and we will leave without a deal. And again, right. that is nothing new. That's something that I said on the floor.
So the option is deal or no deal, not remain.
We can't possibly remain because, as a matter of...
I mean, technically we can.
Well, as a matter of law, we've started the process, and as a matter of law, under Article 50, we will be leaving the European Union in March of 2019.
But I think, as a matter of law, it can be stopped.
I think that that's highly debatable.
But wouldn't that really be the option? If it's a meaningful vote, it's accept the deal. It's no deal and leave, or it's remain.
Well, A, I don't believe that is the legal position, so I challenge that. But yeah. B, politically, it's impossible. The country has voted to leave the European Union, and I think that any government or parliament that decided to overrule the vote of the British people in that referendum would be playing with fire.
Okay, Tom, do you think people you've been talking to in Scotland and Wales would be reassured by what David Jones is saying there?
Well, I think, look, the issue is going to keep on coming up, and what is needed is the government to focus on the things that matter. With the EU withdrawal bill particularly, it's about getting it through. And as we've seen with these amendments that are building up, they're going to have to, it seems, make some concessions. I'd be interesting to know from Mr. Jones whether on the devolution side of all of this, you think that there is a compromise to be done, perhaps with a sunset clause on that EU-retained law, putting a time limit on it, because that's what we heard from Andrew R.T. Davies effectively saying there, that they think some sort of limit. Would that be enough?
That's something that we can discuss, but I think that it is necessary for the various administrations to talk seriously about this issue. There's no doubt that some powers do properly belong at Westminster, and that's where they should remain. And I think that the discussion that we need to have is which of the remaining powers are actually passed down to the
do you think that the consultation so far has been adequate? Because certainly I think it's true to say that Nicola Sturgeon has complained quite loudly that she hasn't been consulted as she was promised she would be by Mrs. May.
I know there are a lot of complaints. You have to remember that really what both the Scottish and Welsh administrations want is as much competence as possible passing down to them, so they will use actually every tactic in the book, including complaining or lack of consultation. I actually think that there's been a considerable amount of consultation, and that will continue.
But the logic of the government's position, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the long run, as a result of this Brexit process, there will be more power going back to Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland.
Yeah, yes. None of the devolved administrations are going to be deprived of any powers that they've got at the moment, that they exercise at the moment. But they will get more as well, and that's always been the government's position.
But the Scottish Secretary was asked numerous times in Scotland Questions yesterday, multiple times, maybe 10 times, by various SNP MPs, to name one single power that he could identify now, which would be retained by the UK initially and then handed back to Holyrood, and he refused to do so.
Probably because there's a negotiating process going on, and he's not going to reveal his cards at the moment.
OK, well, I'll leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed.